Great. Well, thank you so much. That was an incredibly broad set of presentations with lots of wonderful information. Some of it requires us to act, etc. So I'd like to first start off, and it follows from the last panel. So some of the pieces of that many of you have talked about was about raising public awareness. And the question I have is that we do, as communities in this area, we do have programs, and some of them were mentioned in the presentations, to reach out to the public through maps and workshops and et cetera, et cetera. But has anyone in your experience, in your areas of expertise in your countries, looked at the success? How successful are we at raising public awareness? And I'm wondering if Maria would like to start, because it seemed to me that she mentioned the fact that her country folks have landslide amnesia.
Thank you. I think, yeah, this is a very broad subject, but I try to make it quick. We face this problem that people are a bit of aware of landslides that are very common in the Polish mountains, but on the other hand, they are very stick to their ground. The ground owners tend to not want to move from the place they own the ground. So that is why the big activity that we perform is to those seminars and workshops in their area to raise the people public awareness. The major effect is that the mayors and local geologists are more aware of the problem, and they tend to cooperate with us to include landslides in the land use planning in a proper way. So it means that not only the legislations are met, but also in practice they tend to not allow people to build in those hazard areas. But the biggest achievement, I think, from our side since the beginning of the project, which was 2006, are the legislations changes. So the cooperation with the ministry and the politics that lead to actually change the law is the biggest achievement, because if the law is changed and if by law people cannot build on landslides, then we can see the progress that the risk is reduced. So the law which is now is still not perfect, but since 1997, so the first flood that led to the major landslide disaster, we made some few changes in the law, so we are in a good track. But you see how long it takes. Now we have 2023, and we are still not. The law is still not perfect in our sense. So.
It sounds like that approach is very successful. Raising public awareness, that informs the policy and the lawmakers, and so you have made good progress. That's good news in terms of maybe the timeliness isn't as fast as we like.
Kate, it's Andrew here. I do have a comment on this one, if you don't mind me jumping in.
Please do, jump right in.
I think that one of the things to emphasise here is that a hazards conversation is a continuous conversation, and depending on where you are and what you're doing, there are often good education opportunities in the routine, in the everyday, and so it's most important to have that public relationship in whatever way is appropriate in order to be able to talk about when times are bad. Now, in my profession, I'm a meteorologist. It's very easy because everyone talks about the weather a lot, obsessively. And so it's relatively straightforward to use every engagement as an education opportunity. So if someone's talking about cyclones, we say, no, okay, so let's talk about the risks of tropical cyclones. Do you know it's not just wind intensity, it's also rainfall intensity and things like that. I think it's a lot harder in the academic space, but there are ways, again, depending on the trusted partnerships, there are ways that the research and the, what I'll call the operations community, can work to advance the public discourse in a way that sort of slowly educates the population.
Yeah, I brought that topic up because I find that, you know, where we live here in British Columbia, we don't necessarily assess how good we're doing in terms of that awareness. And so, as you say, it takes a lot of effort, and you need to make sure it happens, but it's something that perhaps we should begin to be working more closely with. I know many are, but working with some of the social scientists who actually put that front and center in terms of assessing the tools that we use to raise that awareness. But Andrew, now that I had many questions from your presentation. One of them, I hope you don't mind me jumping around, but the approach that you presented is very ambitious and needed, of course. But you mentioned pilot projects. Do you have an example where some of us could take away and think about in terms of a pilot project to move this along in terms of an international operational geohazard approach?
Yeah, sure. So I'll stick to the volcanology area, which I was talking about. But let me first start with the general comment that central governments love to see cooperation. They do not like to fund anything where they can see that people are fighting with each other. So a pilot project that shows something that potentially saves lives and has everyone already playing very nicely is an attractive thing to invest in my opinion. So in terms of meteorology and volcanology, there are some nice examples already where volcanologists are working with meteorologists with ashfall forecasting. So Iceland has a lovely institutional situation where they've done the hard work of bringing agencies together, and now they're sort of evolving their processes so that when a volcano goes off, the ashfall modelling is informed by the same model that works with the dispersion for aircraft. Obviously, we remember the amount of disruption that's come from Iceland previously, and where the hazards are being dealt with an integrated science approach. In the Pacific, Vanuatu has a similar integrated approach that they're developing. Japan, I'm not saying that everything needs to be co-located, but Japan also combine their meteorological and volcanological monitoring, and that gives more opportunities to say, hey, you know, we can do this. So the way that I'm picturing it is having established a belief that yes, we can do lots of things together better. We show some of those sort of simple to execute projects of shared data and better outcomes through that, and then essentially take those to develop worldwide protocols of how things are done, and then use those protocols to sort of work the corridors in Geneva and Paris and elsewhere, of, you know, gently evolving the scope of the organisations that deal with these things.
Thank you for that. And I don't want to. One of the interesting aspects of this panel was, in fact, of course, these international projects where we can all work together, but in places like the lack of sensor systems in an area like the Ethiopian Rift obviously means that we have to come together to see how we can actually bring others up to the same level of monitoring so that they can be equally part of these kinds of international efforts.
Yeah, I have a comment on that, if I may.
Yes, please.
The World Meteorological Organization is leading an effort at the moment, which I think is quite, it's challenging and it's interesting. And I need to disclose I've done a little bit of work for them on this, just a small piece of work, but it's called the Systematic Observations Financing Facility. And the concept is essentially to say, look, it's ridiculous to ask any developing country to carry the observational monitoring workload all by itself, so for something that has broader implications. And so what we could do as a global community is work out what standard of monitoring is required, and then call in the international development assistance networks to invest in that together, ensure the observations from that are shared, and then consider, does this need to be a sustained global effort rather than a short 3-year project or something, where we accept that monitoring the planet for the good of humanity means that we need to do some kind of wealth distribution in order to do that. Now, there are lots of issues in there, but also there's a lot of potential when we consider that global inequity that we see.
Thank you for that. And
Oh, sorry, go on.
oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Andrew.
I thought that Jill might have something to say if she's willing.
I can. Yeah, I think it's really important. The East African Rift is a seismically active area and also volcanically active, as Dr. Ayeli mentioned. It is really, really hard to fund the monitoring systems to the extent required to be able to monitor that. And I think I would certainly second what Andrew was saying there. How do we do that globally to ensure that where there is high seismic risk or high volcanic risk, that those systems are adequately funded so that we can have equitable disaster risk reduction globally?
Exactly, yes. I guess since we have a few more minutes, one of the general questions I have, I mean, it's obvious when geohazards happen, a landslide, tsunami, earthquake, as many people have talked about in their presentations, the focus is on, the response, and everyone remembers it for a short amount of time, and then there's that amnesia associated with it. And in the geohazard community, is there a concern that the fact that now we're starting to see increased impacts from climate change that are somewhat separate, and for the most part separate from the hazards we've been talking about here, that could lead to a further lack of emphasis on these on the geohazard monitoring and appropriate public engagement? Jill or Andrew, you seem to probably be the most up to speed on those kinds of topics.
I don't want to talk too much, but I might just give an opinion. Again, acknowledging my bias as a meteorologist, I think that there is kind of an assumption amongst some of the international development community that climate change means you just need to think about climate hazards, which obviously wouldn't stand scrutiny, but I'm not sure if it's really articulated very strongly. I did a bit of a look at this last year. As a simple example, if the sea levels rise, well, what does that mean for tsunami impacts? What does that mean for volcanic tsunami impacts? What does that mean for coastal liquefaction? I don't know, but just looking at the way some of the development agencies consider what is a climate thing and therefore gets funding and what isn't a climate thing, I wonder if there's a lot more scope to really articulate how the different hazards are affected and also the way that those hazards can interact in a compounding or cascading event means that climate change is a huge challenge for all of us across the disciplines.
I totally agree. Jill, did you want to add anything before we wrap this session up?
Yeah, I would certainly kind of second that. I mean, just experience over the last couple of weeks in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with the extreme weather. So the what was considered to be perhaps a 1 in 200 year flood and rainfall event is happening more frequently. We've seen really extensive landslides, horrendous flooding, and impacts on the communities. And I think there's perhaps misunderstanding as well. I've seen commentary saying, "Oh, we had a 1 in 100 year flood in 2018. That means we're not due for another one." That's not a correct statement. And understanding that that's not a correct statement, being prepared for those kind of events that are being exacerbated by climate change and framing it in that way is really, really important.
Yes, I fully agree. I just wanted to thank all of the panelists. The presentations were excellent, and from my own perspective, I learned a tremendous amount just by listening to all of these speakers from all over the world. So I'll stop there and thank you and turn it back over to Jill.